Welcome to this webinar for the Future DMRB project. My name is Maria Pia Angelino, and I'm a senior engineer in WSP. Over the last 2.5 years, I have been working closely with the Technical Assurance and Governance Group of Highways England on the Future DMRB project. So let's start this presentation. There are 5 things that I'd like to cover today. This session will last 1 hour, and it is a short introduction to the Future DMRB and to the drafting rules. So what I'm going to do is to start providing an overview of the project as a whole. I will then focus my attention on the close drafting principles, document drafting, and then I will explain you what kind of ongoing support is provided for document authors. Let's start with session number 1, the introduction. There are 3 objectives for today. First of all, I'd like to present the future vision for the DMRB and the practical implications of the project as a whole. I will then introduce the new approach to drafting, and I would also clarify the 4 deliverables for the DMRB review. There are 4 outcomes from today. I'd like you to understand the key components of the Future DMRB project and the new language that has been adopted. It's also important for you to have familiarity with the new editorial style and the content of the manual for development of documents. The third important outcome from today is for you to understand the necessity of compliance with the new structure and style of documents. And I would also like to answer your questions at the end of the webinar. There are a number of key people in the Future DMRB project, and it is important that you're familiar with these names. We have Steve Davey, he's the project sponsor. Suleiman Sattar, the project manager, so he's the person where you can ask some specific questions for day-by-day issues. We have Becky Axtell and Maurice Jones. They are the content specialists and are key people in our discussion because they will provide you with progressive assurance for the work you will be doing on the drafts. And we also have Simon Harshen. Simon is the EU legislation advisor, and he will provide specific feedback if your document has to be notified to the European Commission, for example. Let's move on to session number 2. In this session, there are 2 elements that I want to present: the vision for the DMRB and the practical implication of this project, which are relevant to you. At the moment, the Future DMRB project is a top priority for Highways England, and in particular the Standards, Engineering and Safety Directorate from 2017 to 2020. There are fundamentally 2 reasons for undertaking the update of the DMRB. First of all, it is a license requirement, and I will explain you what I mean with that in a few seconds. But there are also a number of issues in terms of age and quality of documents. So when Highways England became Highways England from the Highways Agency, in this transition, a number of obligations went on this new company. And as a result of that, one of these was specific for the DMRB review. So there is an expectation that Highways England is going to update the design manual for roads and bridges by the end of March 2020. So because of this obligation, the full rollout of the DMRB project started in 2017, in April 2017, and is going to finish by the end of March 2020. We also have a number of issues in terms of age and quality of documents. In particular, we have seen that there is a significant number of documents which is more than 15 years old. And at the same time, we also have documents which don't have the right quality. So to give you an example of that, you can see in this slide a typical case that you can find in the DMRB documents. So you have a very long paragraph with a variety of different types of information. And the key aspect of the future DMRB project is to make sure that these clauses can be detangled and you're able to extract the key requirements from your documents, plus providing the supporting advice that is needed. In 2015, we carried out a consultation with a number of key stakeholders that was part of the obligations on Highways England, and we explored the current situation of the DMRB, but also the needs for the future. We engaged 100 consultees across the UK construction industry, and we received a significant number of responses, around more than 60, which were mainly corporate responses. And we used them to develop first the consultation report and secondly the 11 recommendations, which I will show you in the next slide. The 11 recommendations have been approved by the Highways England Executive Committee, and they underpin the entire work programme that we are undertaking. I'm not going to spend time on all of them. I just want to clarify those that are key for this discussion today. First, the future DMRB is going to define clear and unambiguous requirements that have to be fulfilled by designers. So the core of this webinar is to provide you an overview of how the new requirements will be drafted and how to make sure that there is a clear distinction between requirements and advice. The second recommendation that I want to highlight is one that you can see at the bottom of the page. So we will provide a reduced volume of advice. The point here is that at the moment we have around 55% of the content in the DMRB which is advisory, and we want to make sure that the advice that is provided is relevant to fulfill specific requirements. If this is not the case, and if general information, background information is provided, this content has to be removed, extracted, and can be either deleted or moved to external publications as relevant. The third recommendation that I want to highlight is quite a simple one, and it is about a future DMRB which will have a consistent style and format and be intuitive to use. Although this is quite obvious, so everybody would like a consistent document set, be intuitive to use, the implication of this recommendation is quite large because it requires the entire DMRB to be republished again to make sure that the content is really consistent. And this is what we are going to do over the next couple of years. The last recommendation that I want to highlight is the one on future-proofing the content. This is another key one because this is once in a generation opportunity for Highways England to update the entire DMRB, and we also want to make sure that we have in place a database which can then be used in the future for third parties to develop their own applications using the DMRB as a basis. We also want to streamline the process of drafting and publishing the documents. So for all these reasons, we have developed a new software and database which will support a future DMRB which is future-proofed for advances in information technology. And I will give you a bit more detail on that in session number 5 when I will present you some IT tools which have been introduced recently in Highways England. If we want to summarize all these recommendations into one vision statement, this is what we got. So the future DMRB will define clear and unambiguous requirements to ensure that the overseeing organizations can discharge their obligations. So clearly the key point of this webinar and of the training that we are providing across the UK is about developing clear and unambiguous requirements. That's the key part of the process. There are also 4 practical implications of this work that you have to be aware of. I will come back to this slide at the end of the presentation, but I think it's important for you to see now what are the key changes that will happen over the next couple of years. There will be, first of all, a new style and format for documents, and I will explain you in terms of style and format, what we mean with that. There is also a new structure for the entire document set, which I will show you in the next slide. It's also important to recognize that from the 1st of April 2017, interim advice notes were no longer issued. So if there are for all existing interim advice notes, but also advisory documents, A documents, the expectation is that these documents are either incorporated into relevant D documents in the DMRB or developed as standalone documents. And the fourth point, the first practical implication, is that in the future we will have national application annexes which will accompany the main documents, the core DMRB document, and which will provide requirements specific for the overseeing organization, so for Highways England and the devolved administrations as well. So regarding the point number 2, the new structure of the entire document set, it is useful for you to see what the future structure will look like. At the moment, we have 12 volumes in the DMRB, which contain a variety of different types of information. We have documents around specific assets, documents on subject areas like sustainability. Some documents are defined in terms of asset life cycle, but there is not a consistent structure to the document set. So what we have done has been to restructure the entire DMRB around life cycle stages, which will be the new volumes of the future DMRB. You can see on the screen the different stages from we have a volume on general information, a volume on appraisal, design, construction, and so on. And then we have a number of rows which are in terms of subject types or asset types. So there will be fundamentally 4 parts: one on general aspects, one on sustainability and environmental aspects, one on civil engineering, and one on technology. And we have also allocated lots of numbers for each of these documents, so that the future documents will have a new coding system given by the combination of the volume, the specific part, the specific asset, and then the block of number which has been allocated for different disciplines, like the MCHW approach. Another important benefit of using these metrics is that in the future, all the document sets managed by Highways England can be incorporated into it. So at the moment, the DMRB, because it is a design manual, most of its content will be allocated between general information, appraisal, and design volumes. But in the future, the intention is to include also the content for from the MCHW under the construction volume, the content on management and maintenance under the maintenance and operation and inspection volumes. And in the technology rows on the right-hand side of the screen will be allocated the documents from the TSS plans registry. So they will be placed for every document into these metrics. So in this session, what I have presented you is the vision for the future DMRB and the 4 practical implications in terms of new style and format of documents, new metric structure for the entire document set, the national application annexes, and how we will manage interim advice notes and A documents in the future. Let's move on to session number 3 now. This is about the close drafting principles. I want to emphasize that I'm going to provide you an overview of the key principles, but if you need to draft documents, if you're a lead author for a document, you're going to attend a 4-hour training session where you will also be doing some exercises on these aspects. There are 4 things that I will cover in this session. I will explain you the 2 verbal forms that will be used for requirements, the 3 verbal forms for advice. I will provide some additional considerations how to manage requirements and advice in the text. And I will then present you the close numbering system that we have introduced in the documents. This is a summary of the key points in this section, and I will give you a bit more detail on each of them over the next few minutes. First of all, there are two verb forms for requirements, must and shall, and I will explain when to use them. There are three verb forms for advice, should, may, and can. An important aspect of our work is to make sure that advice, when it is provided, relates to a specific requirement. So you will not have floating advice in your documents. Every advice provided has to be linked to a specific requirement. You're also expected to avoid ambiguous phrases like consideration should be given or preference must be taken, because from a contractual point of view, these cannot be controlled and they are too vague and subjective. I will also emphasize the importance of identifying implicit requirements, in particular in A documents, which are phrased as advice, and the importance of changing them into proper requirements. I will also present you the concept of independence of clauses, how conditional clauses have to be expressed, and also the numbering system, the new numbering system. So let me start with the concept of requirements. A requirement is a statement which can either reflect a legislative requirement, which comes from law, or can reflect a need of the overseeing organization. So the main distinction between these two types of requirements is that in the first case, a designer cannot departure from a legislative requirement. It cannot departure from law. Whereas in the second case, there is a departure process which enables a designer to put a departure and suggest something different. So that's the key distinction. And the way in which we make this distinction in practice is to use two verb forms. We will use must for legislative requirements and shall for all the other requirements, for the requirements of the overseeing organizations. So the 95% of the time in your documents you will use shall, unless you're providing a specific reference to legislation, and in that case you will be using must. So at this point of the training session, the 4-hour training session, I normally do an exercise with the attendees, and I ask them to fill in the blank spaces with must or shall according to the need. And what I want to highlight in this exercise is the importance. If you see the statement number 3, you can see that that's the only one where a must has been provided. And it is the only one because it is a specific reference to legislation, whereas in all the other cases, those are requirements of the overseeing organizations and not requirements from law. Let's move on to the concept of advice. Advice is an optional provision, and it can be presented in different ways. So you can have advice which is presented as a recommendation because it is a specific, a strong advice you're given to the designer. Can be presented as an option to verify a requirement or a permission given to a designer. It can also be a clarification of a concept or a statement of a fact. So normally this is what we call notes in standards. Or advice can also be best practice. The key thing is that in the future, if you're introducing advisory content in your documents, this content has to relate to a specific requirement. And the way in which we enforce this rule is using a close numbering system, which I will present in a few slides. In order to make a distinction between recommendations, permissions, and clarification of concepts, we have three verbal forms. We use should for recommendations, may for permissions, and can or a general verb in the present tense if we want to clarify a concept or introduce a statement of a fact. Again, at this point, we normally do an exercise where I ask the attendees to introduce in the empty spaces the specific verbal form for advice, should, may, or can. And the answer to this exercise very often is not easy, and it really depends on the specific information that is provided into the document. I also want to highlight that in the future DMRB documents, there are a number of prohibited expressions that we don't want to see in the documents because they are too vague, ambiguous, and from a contractual point of view, they can cause many issues to House England and the devolved administrations. Overall, there are two categories of prohibited expressions. There are contractually ambiguous phrases like care must be taken or consideration should be given. And then we have verbal forms which are not correct. For example, you should not use must if it's not a legislative requirement. You cannot use will or other verbal forms which are not must or shall. And similarly, we have a list of prohibited expressions for advice, which are very similar to those provided for requirements. You just need to be careful not introducing verbal forms like might or could, those kind of expressions which are not allowed in the new drafting rules. I have to say that a big challenge in redrafting the clauses is to make sure that the contractually ambiguous phrases are not provided. So it takes sometimes quite a significant effort to rephrase these kind of clauses because in the first place it was not clear the intention of or the purpose of the clause, and it is important for document authors to spend some time and make sure that these clauses are provided in an appropriate way. I also want to say that the content specialists have been appointed to support you in redrafting these clauses. So if there are any problems or you believe that you need some specific help, please ask Maurice Jones and Becky Axel. This is again another example we do during the 4-hour training. And in this case, what we do is to rephrase the clauses, in particular the ambiguous phrases. There are a number of things that it's also important for you to understand. First of all, if you're dealing with an A document, an advisory DMRB document, in a few cases you will notice that although in theory it should contain only advisory material, in a few cases it also contains some specific requirements. So because in the future all documents have to be requirements and advice documents, you're expected to extract this content and provide it with an appropriate balance between requirements and advice. Another important thing that you have to bear in mind is that in the future DMRB, clauses have to be independent, which means that if you're dealing with, if you're presenting a clause, you need to make sure that it is understandable and readable without linking to other clauses. It means that linking adverbs like in addition or however should not be used, as well as some specific pronouns like these can be done or that is not allowed. So those expressions cannot be used because they are too vague, and you have to clearly define what is the subject of your clause. So in many cases you will be expected to repeat the subject for clarity in your sentences. We have also developed a preferred expression to present conditional clauses. So for example, if you have a clause which says if that specific condition, if that situation happens, that requirements applies. So the way in which we structure these clauses is to say where and then the specific condition. After that you have your requirement, recommendation or permissible approach. In a few cases we have also seen that when in a section you have multiple conditional expressions, it can be helpful to translate all these conditional expressions into a flowchart to guide the designer in understanding how the different requirements or advice interact each other. This can be particularly helpful if you have a variety of different legislations, for example, and it is not entirely clear how they interact each other. So introducing some flowcharts based on conditional expressions can be very helpful. Let me show you the new numbering system. It is a very simple structure. So the future document will have a first level number, which is associated with the section of the document. Then there are a number of subheadings, which are not numbered. And then most of the text will contain two level numbers, which are the requirements. So you have 6.1 is your requirement, and then you can provide the relevant advice either as a note or you can then provide advice with a 3-level number, as you can see on the screen. So if, for example, you have section number 5 and your requirement is 5.3, you can have 531, which is the first advice related to 5.3. It's a very intuitive structure. And this is an example for you. So you can see 3.1 is your first requirement, and then you have the advice, a couple of notes, another advice, and other notes after it. But your key requirement is at the top with 3.1. You're not expected to develop a template to do that, because a template has already been prepared by us. It is a Word template with predefined lockdown styles. Let me show you an example. So at the top of the bar, you can see that you can select your text style, which can be with a 2-level number for requirements, a 3-level for advice. You have a text style for every detail of your document. But importantly, this is just an interim solution, because from the 1st of April, the new online system, the CARS, Collaborative Authoring Review System, will replace the Word templates. So from the 1st of April, CARS will be mandatory, and you will no longer be using the Word template. So what we suggest is to start using CARS now, if you have the opportunity, to start familiarizing with the new system, and clearly that requires a discussion and agreement with your document owner. But from the 1st of April, the expectation is that everybody will be using CARS. So let me summarize again the points that I have discussed in this session. So I showed you the 2 verbal forms for requirements, must and shall, the 3 verb forms for advice, should, may, and can. I made the point that advice will always relate to a requirement. That's a key point in our discussion. You're also expected to rephrase some expressions, and that can be quite time-consuming. There are a number of implicit requirements phrased as advice, so please make sure you extract those. And you also have to make clauses independent and follow the rules for conditional expressions. There is also a numbering system that we have developed, and that is basically done using the Word template and in the future CARS. And there is a point number 9, which is around performance-based requirements. I've not discussed this aspect in this webinar, but I just want you to be aware that there is a specific obligation on Highways England to move from prescriptive documents to more performance-based standards. This is a complex area. We covered that during the 4-hour training. If you want to know more about that, please be in touch with me, with the content specialists, and we will support you in how to draft performance-based standards and requirements. In this slide, you can see a checklist of points that it would be helpful for you to consider when you start reviewing the drafts. First of all, you have to have in mind what the suppliers have to do. And once you have clarity on that, you can define what the key requirements are in your document, and also what does Highways England need control over. So if you know that there are specific areas where Highways England would like control, that means that those have to be provided as requirements. Otherwise, you may think about changing some requirements into recommendations, and in that case, you're losing control because there is no departure process against advice. In terms of presenting clauses, please make sure that when you're ordering the requirements, you put the most general first and then the specific ones later, and also make sure that you're not undermining requirements each other. We have seen in a few cases, particularly in large documents, that in a section you provide specific requirements, and then after a few pages, requirements which is in contrast with the previous one is provided. So just make sure that the requirements are consistent. Also double check statutory requirements. If there is a must, in that case, the text has also to include the name of the regulation. If there are multiple alternatives, in that case, probably you should not consider them as requirements, but as advisory content. We don't allow floating advice, and if you believe that the advice does not add any value, delete it, but make sure that you're not deleting important stuff from the documents. An important point is that it can be challenging to redraft ambiguous phrases. So if you believe that this is very difficult for you, please ask the content specialist and they will help you. Let's move on to session number 4, document drafting. What I'd like to do in this session is to provide a quick overview of 5 things: the new manual for development of documents, the deliverables for each document, the work required, how to engage with the content specialist, how to review existing documents, and a number of lessons that could be useful for you to be aware of. In terms of manual, at the moment, the manual is made up of 2 parts. We have a part 1 on governance of document development, and this part is very much relevant for document owners, group managers, divisional directors. It's not that relevant for document authors, because in this document you will find information on notification processes, publication, business management. If you're a document author, what is important for you is part number 2 on document drafting rules. In here you will find detailed information on the drafting principles and everything that I have presented in this webinar, but presented in more detail into the 4-hour training. In terms of version, at the moment we are using MDD version 4.1, which was released in September. We wanted to issue the new version at the end of January, but because we would like to provide specific guidance on a number of areas that we have received queries over the last couple of weeks, we are going to release the new version around mid-February. So that is the new deadline for that. And once it is ready, that will be circulated to the group program coordinators, the document owners, and everybody, and then will be provided to the document authors, to the supply chain. let me show you now the 4 deliverables for the work. So there are 4 things that the document authors are expected to produce as a result of this work. We have a new document, which has to be aligned with the new manual. We have the National Application Annex for Highways England only. The other devolved administrations will develop their NAAs. There is a changelog and a background document. So in terms of, let me spend a couple of minutes on each of these areas. In terms of new document, the new document will contain a number of sections which are not numbered, as you can see on the screen, and then there are the numbered section from section number 1. So the forward is the section that will not contain requirements, as well as the introduction. The first section where you can start having the distinction between requirements and advice is section number 1, the scope section. And importantly, in this section there are a number of standard subheadings that the 2, 3, and 4 have already been populated. You only have to clarify what are the aspects covered in your document. After that, you can have as many sections as you like, and at the end of your document you will have the appendices. The key point of appendices is that they will be informative only, so you cannot provide requirements in the appendices. The requirements have to be in the main text. The second part of the deliverables, the second key deliverable is in terms of national application annexes. So the NAAs are optional documents which have to be developed if you want to provide specific requirements for the overseeing organizations. So if you want to include a requirement which is relevant for Highways England only or for Transport Scotland only, that cannot be presented into the main text, but will be presented into the NAA. Having said that, it is important to understand that the number of NAAs should be kept to a minimum. So the chief highways engineers would like minimal or no clauses into the NAAs, because the desire is to have a core document agreed across the UK and only NAAs when they are really needed, for example, because of different legislations or because of different climatic situations in different countries. But overall, the NAAs have to be agreed across the UK. In terms of structure of these documents, they will have the same structure as the DMRB. The only difference is in terms of abbreviations. So, for example, you will find E for Highways England and I for the Northern Ireland. And your clauses will start with this abbreviation depending on the NAA that has to be developed. The document authors working for Highways England will be expected to develop the NAA for Highways England only. In terms of changelog, changelog and background document are 2 important parts of the future DMRB update, because they will provide a fundamental tool to avoid that content is lost from one document to another, but at the same time that we know isn't behind the new clauses that have been developed, but also for the clauses that have been changed. The changelog is the document that the document authors will be developing against the original DMRB document. So you can see on the screen that it is a table. On the left-hand side, the original text will be provided. On the right-hand side, the commentary will be provided. It has to be a short commentary which explains what happened to the content, if it was deleted or if it would just move to a different place. But overall, it does not have to provide a long description, but just a track of a checklist of what happened to the original text. And at the top of this table, you can see the efficiency schedule. And for the change log, you're expected to clarify what kind of efficiency is gained by Highways England by deleting content. So, for example, if you're deleting a clause which caused many departures in the past, your Highways England is gaining a lot of savings because every departure costs 21k, 7 for Highways England and 14 for the supply chain to process. So that discussion was for the change log. The background document is done against the new document developed. So the key difference is that the change log is done against the old one, the background document is done against the new one. And in this case, we want to understand the origin of new clauses and the commentary and the rationale for changes made or additions made to the original text. Again, you can see the efficiency schedule at the top, but in this case, what we want to see is the efficiency gained by changing clauses or introducing new ones. I also want to emphasize that the efficiency schedule is done at document level, not clause level. So it is a general efficiency that can be gained from this process. And slide, you can also see that there are a number of examples that you can consider when you're drafting this table. Let me now spend a couple of minutes on the engagement with the content specialists. We have seen in a few cases that the content specialists receive the completed drafts very late in the process. And they were also asked to provide comments and feedback in a very short amount of time. You have to think about that the content specialists will have to manage a huge number of documents, so they have to manage their workload in an effective way. So as a result of that, what we ask to the document authors is to start an early engagement with the content specialists and avoid that they will receive drafts too late for them to review and also too late for you to update as a result of their comments. If you don't manage this engagement in a proper way, what is going to happen is that the document is not ready for the TPB and the TPB date is not met, and this is not acceptable because the work program is the time scales are very tight and the deadlines have to be met. So what we suggest to document authors is to meet 2 intermediate milestones to avoid that there is a lot of rework at the end of the process. We would like the authors to submit, this is not mandatory, I want to highlight that. It's not mandatory, it is good practice to avoid a lot of rework at the end of the process. So it would be incredibly useful if you draft a couple of sections and send those sections to your document content specialist to receive some quick feedback on your drafting. And if you're working with a large document, it would also be most effective for you to send roughly 25 to 50% of the complete documents to the content specialist so that he or she can check and provide progressive assurance of your work. At the same time, when you start drafting your document, please make sure that you communicate to your content specialist when they will receive your final completed draft. That is fundamental for them in order to manage their workload. So please communicate them when you will provide the final draft. And at the same time, they will let you know when they will tell you, they will confirm their availability to review the draft and when they will provide feedback and comments. That will also help you in managing your workload as a document author and meet your deadlines with the TPB. In terms of revision of documents, it is important for you to understand that in this drafting process, there are 3 steps you're expected to follow. Most of the time, in the past, your focus was mainly on technical updates and some minor editing updates. And the preliminary screening exercise was not really done in the past from our experience. What we have found fundamental in this DMRB review is that you spend a sufficient amount of time to understand, to ask a number of questions before that you start drafting. And these questions are, first of all, if the document is needed. So before drafting, have a good discussion with your document owner and make sure that the document is really needed. And if not, please discuss what kind of justification should be provided before withdrawing the document. The second question is in terms of moving content from your document to other documents. You can realize that in a few cases, your content, the content in your document is much more relevant in another DMRB document, so it has to be moved. Again, please have a discussion with the document owner and make sure that you record where the content should be moved. There can be also cases where advice can be reduced, can be, for example, moved to external third parties to be managed, like BSI or Syria. So please consider this opportunity before starting to draft. Then, if you identify content which is specific for the devolved administrations or Highways England only, that has to be moved to the national application annexes. If you identify construction requirements, please make sure that these requirements are extracted from your document, from the DMRB document, and are provided into the MCHW. And in order to facilitate this process, the document owner has to contact Science in Highways England, who is responsible for the MCHW. Similarly, if you find maintenance requirements in your documents, requirements which are relevant for maintenance people, not designed for maintenance requirements, I just want to clarify that point, the document owner has to contact the Customer and Operational Requirements Group and liaise with them on the most appropriate place to provide this information. And finally, because the future DMRB is about motorway and all-purpose trunk roads, if you find requirements which are specific for the local authorities, these requirements have to be identified, extracted, and they will be managed in the future by the local authorities. So at the moment, there is a place in JIRA, which is used in Highways England to manage the Standard Forward Programme. There is a place in JIRA to capture all this information, whether you're dealing with a construction requirement or a maintenance requirement, or you just want to move content from one document to another. All these things have to be provided in JIRA so that we can track this information and make sure that nothing is lost through this process. So to summarize, when I talk about preliminary screening, the key point is make sure that before you start drafting the document, you have a discussion with the document owner and you agree a plan for how the document will be updated. We have developed a document development plan. There is a template for that. And basically this template provides, it is a template which provides the 7 questions that I have presented you in the previous slides. And using this template, you can manage to discuss with your document owners and make sure that you're covering all the key points to review your DMRB document. In terms of, this was all about preliminary screening. You're also expected to carry out technical corrections, which means to update the content with up-to-date material, standards, and guidance. But there is also an editorial update which is important, and this is all about MDD drafting rules using appropriate verbal forms, layout, and style. The last point of this part is about sharing lessons. What I'd like to share with you are 4 general things which are fundamental for our discussion. There are also a number of other lessons, but I believe that those are the key ones for us to understand at this stage. Over the last few months, we have been working with a number of document authors from either the supply chain or How is England. And we have noticed that in a few cases, the challenge is underestimated. So what happened was that in reality, there has to be a cultural shift in the way in which documents are drafted. The drafting rules are different. The timescale is very tight. So there has to be a different way of working, and in some cases that has been underestimated. So please make sure that you, if you're drafting, you have the 4-hour training session and you engage with the relevant people to deliver the documents on time. We have also seen that using the new drafting rules, much clearer and shorter documents have been provided. And when the people follow the guidance developed in the MDD, the document is of high quality, but perhaps most importantly for the project, for the drafting teams, is that the teams have a sense of satisfaction because the document produced was really good. The 4th lesson is around collaboration. The best documents we have seen so far are the result of a close collaboration between document author, technical specialist, content specialist, and document owner. When this collaboration did not work very well, the document was delayed or its quality was not the appropriate one. So please make sure that you engage with the relevant people at the right time. To conclude this webinar, I just want to provide some general information on the ongoing support that is provided. So this is just a short training session, a 1-hour training session for people who would like to refresh their knowledge of the DMRB project, people who have attended the 4-hour training session, or people who are not leading authors but would like to know something around the DMRB project. For people who are actually going to draft documents, what we a specific requirement for them is to attend the 4-hour training. We are also delivering some periodic webinars for How is England and the supply chain. In April, there will be 3 workshops to share lessons between How is England and the supply chain. More information will be provided soon. We also have available a number of templates and briefing papers, and we have a full communication strategy in place. There are also a number of people who are available to you, the content specialist and the technical assurance and governance group as a whole. There are also 3 new tools which are available to you, and it would be important for you to be aware of. And these are the Agile approach to document drafting, Jira, which is the program management tool available to How is England only, and then we have CARS, the Collaborative Authoring Review System. I don't have time to spend on these areas, but for the purpose of this webinar, what I'd like to say is Agile is fundamental to streamline document drafting. So if you believe that if you want to apply this approach and make sure the document is done in a shorter amount of time, please contact TAG, talk to your document owner, and then we will arrange for you a facilitator of the Agile and we'll also make sure that the sessions run in an appropriate way. CARS is the Collaborative Authoring Review System, which is the online tool that is now under development, but from the 1st of April will be mandatory to draft the DMRB documents. So if you want to apply CARS now, please discuss with your document owner, with the group program coordinators, and if they agree that you can use CARS, you can start using it. You will receive a specific training and also the login details to use this online tool to draft documents. From the 1st of April, it will be mandatory, but in the meantime, if you believe it's relevant for you, please feel free to ask, and you will receive also training for that. Some closing remarks. From what I wanted to achieve from today was to give you an overview of the future DMRB vision, the practical implications, the new approach to drafting, and also the 4 deliverables of the DMRB work. And what I like that you have taken from today is to understand the key components of the project, the language adopted into the new manual for development of documents, and the importance of complying with the new structure and style of DMRB documents. So what I'm going to do now is to open the discussion, and I will take the questions.
Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. As a reminder, all lines are now open. If you wish to ask a question, please be advised that if you are not asking a question, to keep your lines muted in order to reduce background noise. All lines are now open. Thank you.
I already have some questions in the Q&A box.
So, hi Maria here, this is Becky. So,
hi Becky.
Nasir has posted some really good questions. I've answered a few of the easy ones already.
Perfect.
And then we've got a few more remaining.
So we have, there is a question which says, key requirements are not always straightforward to identify. How to identify them and ensure important information does not get simply deleted? So normally, when you're dealing with requirements, you have to be extra careful in deleting them. So if you delete advice, first of all, advice does not have to add any value before being deleted. But in case of requirements, you have to be careful, because if you delete requirements, you can introduce some risks on the network, and you have to be aware of them. In terms of key requirements, how can be identified, it really depends on the specific document. We have seen a few documents where the requirements provided were not entirely relevant, or they were phrased in a way that was not understandable and not to the point. So normally the document author, who is an expert, a technical specialist in the field, would be able to identify those requirements which are key for the document itself. So I hope that answers your question. Then I have an observation. There is an observation from... Okay, so there is an observation from experience. Some suppliers may encourage document owners to move a lot into MCHW to reduce the drafting work. The answer to this it is important that you raise this observation. What I want to say on that is, the reason for moving stuff from the DMRB to the MCHW is because of the audience. The MCHW audience is contractors. So if there is content in the DMRB which is relevant for contractor, that has to be moved to the MCHW. If there is a content which the suppliers would like to move to the MCHW, but it's not relevant to contractors, then that's not the appropriate place, and they cannot do that. So that it's all about audiences. If it's about designers, it will stay into the DMRB. If it is about contractors, it will move to the MCHW. The last question that I have is, would dog owners or suppliers require agile training to apply this tool? The answer is yes. So there is training will be provided if you decide to follow the agile approach. You will receive a Scrum Master. This is how this person is called. He's the facilitator of the process. And he or she will help you and the drafting team to work over a specified period of time, which normally is a couple of weeks.
Okay, thank you.
You're welcome.
Sounds good.
Do we have other questions? I cannot see any other questions. So if there aren't, I'd like to thank you very much for your attention, and I hope you found the presentation relevant to you. If you have any feedback, I'd be happy to hear from you, so please send me an email. Thank you very much, and I wish you a very good evening.